She spent sleepless nights worrying about her mother's debt, the letters, the threats, the fear of losing everything. One man listened quietly, never saying much, always offering hope. Then one morning, the debt collectors stopped coming, and a sealed envelope arrived instead. Inside was the paid-off note, and his name at the bottom. He had bought her mother's debt in secret, just to hand it back with a smile. The wagon wheel caught the edge of the ravine just as the sky opened up. Rain came down in sheets, cold and merciless, turning the dirt road into a river of mud that pulled at everything it touched. The mare screamed, her hooves slipping on the rocks, and the wagon lurched hard to the left. Clara Wren felt the world tilt, heard the crack of wood splintering beneath her, and then she was falling, hands grasping at air, at reins, at nothing. She hit the ground hard, the breath knocked clean from her lungs. For a moment, all she could hear was the roar of the rain and the wild thrashing of the horse somewhere in the dark. Then she heard the sound that made her heart stop, a soft, breathless gasp from the wagon bed above. "Mama!" Clara scrambled to her feet, boots sinking deep into the mud, and clawed her way up the slope. The wagon had tipped onto its side, contents spilling out in a chaos of fabric and paper and broken glass. And there, half buried beneath a soaked quilt, was her mother, pale as death, eyes fluttering, lips moving without sound. "Mama, stay with me." Clara's voice cracked as she pulled the quilt away, her hands shaking so hard she could barely hold on. Her mother's skin was cold, too cold, and her breathing came in shallow, stuttering gasps that didn't sound like breathing at all. Behind her, she heard the sound of hooves, heavy, deliberate. Clara turned, rain streaming down her face, and saw them, 3 riders, dark shapes against the gray curtain of the storm. Lanterns swung from their saddles, casting wild shadows across the mud. The one in front, a thick-shouldered man with a star pinned to his coat, reined his horse to a stop and looked down at her with the kind of expression that carried no sympathy. "Clara Wren?" His voice was flat, official, the kind of voice that didn't ask questions it didn't already know the answer to. She nodded, unable to speak. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded paper, yellowed and stained with rain. "Got a notice here. Debt on your mother's farm. Payments 3 months overdue. Bank selling the claim." The words hit her like fists. "What? No, we're working on it. We just need—" "Bank don't need anything, miss. Claim's been bought, transfer's already signed." He handed the paper down to her, and she took it with numb fingers, the ink already bleeding in the rain. She tried to read it, but the letters swam together, meaningless. All she could see was her mother's name, and beneath it, a signature she didn't recognize. Who bought it? Her voice was barely a whisper. The man shrugged. "Don't know. Some fella from out of town. Paid in full. Cash. Didn't leave a name." Clara stared at him, her mind spinning, trying to understand. Someone had bought her mother's debt. A stranger. Someone who now held everything they had left in the palm of his hand. "What does that mean?" she asked, though part of her already knew. The man's expression didn't change. "Means the farm ain't yours no more. Means you got 30 days to settle with the new owner, or you're out." The rain kept falling. The horse kept thrashing. Her mother kept breathing, shallow and faint, and Clara felt the ground beneath her feet turn to water. "Please," she whispered. "She's dying. I can't—" But the riders were already turning away, lanterns swinging back into the storm. The sheriff tipped his hat, water pouring from the brim, and his voice drifted back through the rain like a ghost. "Sorry, miss. Ain't nothing I can do." And then they were gone, swallowed by the dark, and Clara was alone, kneeling in the mud beside her mother, holding a piece of paper that meant the end of everything. She didn't cry. There wasn't time for that. She wrapped her arms around her mother's frail body and pulled her close, felt the faint flutter of her heartbeat against her chest. The wagon was ruined. The road was impassable. The storm showed no sign of breaking. But Clara Wren had been born into storms. And if there was one thing she knew how to do, it was survive. She hoisted her mother onto her back, staggering under the weight, and began to walk. 15 miles away, in a town too small to have a name on most maps, a man sat alone in the corner of a saloon that smelled of whiskey and smoke, and the kind of silence that came after too many words had already been said. Eli Mercer didn't look like much. Dust on his boots, faded coat hanging loose from his shoulders, hat pulled low over eyes that didn't seek attention. He'd been riding for 3 days straight, sleeping in barns and under trees, living off jerky and creek water. His hands were rough, scarred from years of work that didn't leave room for softness. But his eyes, calm, steady, carrying the weight of something unspoken, those told a different story. On the table in front of him sat a stack of bills, neatly counted, more money than most men in that town would see in a year. Beside the bills, a single piece of paper, folded and creased from being carried too long in a coat pocket. The barkeep, an older man with a limp and a face like worn leather, leaned against the counter and watched him. "That's a lot of cash to be carrying around, stranger." Eli didn't look up. "It's not mine anymore." "Buying something?" "Something like that." The barkeep limped closer, curiosity getting the better of him. "Mind if I ask what?" Eli finally raised his eyes, and for just a moment, the barkeep saw something in them, something quiet and fierce and impossibly sad. "A chance," Eli said softly. "For someone who deserves one." The barkeep frowned, glanced at the money, then back at Eli. "You buying land? Debt?" The word hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. The barkeep straightened, understanding dawning slowly across his face. "You're buying someone's debt? Why the hell would you do that?" Eli picked up the paper, unfolded it carefully, and stared at the name written there. Clara Wren. Underneath, an address, a farm, a mother too sick to work and a daughter too proud to ask for help. He'd heard about them 2 towns back, from a preacher who talked too much and a banker who talked even more. Heard about the debt that had been hanging over their heads for years, growing like a shadow. Heard about the way the town had turned its back, the way people always did when survival meant looking the other way. Eli had spent most of his life looking the other way, had spent years running from things he couldn't fix, hiding from responsibilities that weren't his to carry. But somewhere along the way, between one town and the next, he'd gotten tired of running, tired of being the kind of man who only saved himself. So he'd gone to the bank, asked how much they owed, counted out every dollar he had left, and signed the papers without giving his name. "She don't need to know it's me," Eli said quietly, folding the paper again and slipping it back into his coat. "She just needs to breathe again." The barkeep shook his head slowly, like he couldn't decide if Eli was a saint or a fool. "What if she finds out? What if she don't take kindly to charity?" Eli stood, leaving the empty glass on the table. "Then I'll deal with that when it comes." He walked to the door, boots heavy on the wooden floor, and paused with his hand on the frame. Outside, the storm was still raging, lightning splitting the sky in jagged white lines. Somewhere out there, in that storm, a girl was carrying her mother through the mud, fighting for something she didn't even know she'd already been given. Eli pulled his hat down low and stepped out into the rain. Clara didn't remember much of that night, just fragments, the weight of her mother on her back, the way the rain turned the world into a blur of gray and black, the distant glow of lanterns from the farmhouse. So far away it seemed like a dream. When she finally reached the porch, her legs gave out. She collapsed onto the wet wood, gasping for air, her mother's body limp and cold in her arms. For a moment she thought she was too late, thought the rain had taken everything, but then her mother coughed, weak, rattling, but alive, and Clara felt something break open inside her chest. Relief, grief, exhaustion so deep it felt like drowning. She dragged her mother inside, laid her on the bed by the fire, and wrapped her in every blanket they had left. The house was cold, the roof leaking in 3 places, but it was shelter, it was home, for now. Clara sat beside the bed, her hands shaking, and stared at the rain-soaked paper still clutched in her fist. The notice, the signature, the name of a man she'd never met who now held her life in his hands. She wanted to be angry, wanted to rage against the unfairness of it all. But she was too tired, too empty. Outside, the storm began to break. The rain slowed to a drizzle, then stopped altogether. The clouds parted, just enough to let a sliver of moonlight through, and it fell across the floor in a pale silver line. Clara closed her eyes and let the exhaustion take her. She didn't know that Mercy had a face, didn't know that somewhere, out in the dark, a man with dust on his boots and calm in his eyes was watching the farmhouse from a distance, making sure she made it home. Didn't know that the debt she feared had already been forgiven, not by a bank, not by a law, but by a stranger who believed she deserved a fair chance. When morning came, the valley was quiet. The storm had washed the world clean, leaving behind a sky so blue it hurt to look at. Clara woke to the sound of birds and the soft, steady breathing of her mother beside her. For a moment, she let herself believe that everything was fine. that the storm had been a bad dream, that the notice in her pocket didn't exist. But when she stood and looked out the window, she saw the broken wagon still lying in the ravine, saw the mud, saw the world exactly as it had been the night before. Nothing had changed, except she was still standing, her mother was still breathing, and somewhere out there a stranger had paid a debt he didn't owe, for reasons she couldn't begin to understand. Clara pulled on her boots, stepped out onto the porch, and looked toward the horizon. The sun was rising, slow and golden, painting the hills in shades of amber and rust. She didn't know his name, didn't know his face. But as the morning light spread across the valley, Clara felt something she hadn't felt in months. Hope. Faint, fragile, but alive. And far off, standing at the edge of the trees with his horse grazing beside him, Eli Mercer watched the farmhouse and allowed himself the smallest of smiles. He'd done what he came to do. Now he just had to make sure she never found out. The wind moved through the grass, carrying the scent of rain and earth and new beginnings. The storm had passed, but the story, the real story, was only just beginning. The sun rose on the third day after the storm, and with it came the silence. Not the peaceful kind, the kind that pressed against the ears and made every small sound feel too loud. The kind that came when the world held its breath, waiting for something to break. Clara stood in the doorway of the barn, a bucket of feed in one hand, and stared out at the broken fence line that ran along the eastern edge of the property. The posts had been leaning for months, held together by rust and stubbornness, but the storm had finished what time had started. Now they sagged like old men, wire-tangled and useless, the whole thing ready to collapse with the next strong wind. She should fix it, should have fixed it a year ago. But there was never enough time, never enough hands, never enough of anything. Behind her, the mare shuffled in her stall, still skittish from the night of the storm. Clara had managed to get her back from the ravine the morning after, half drowned and wild-eyed, but the animal hadn't been the same since, neither had anything else. Her mother was still in bed, still breathing, but barely. The cough that had been with her for months had deepened, settled into her chest like something permanent. The doctor had come once, 2 weeks before the storm, and left a bottle of medicine Clara couldn't afford and a look that said everything the words didn't. Weeks. Maybe a month. Clara had stopped counting days after that. She set the bucket down and walked toward the fence, boots crunching on the brittle grass. The morning air was cool, the kind of cool that promised heat later, and the valley stretched out before her in shades of gold and brown, beautiful in the way dying things sometimes were. She reached the first post and wrapped her hands around it, testing the weight. It shifted under her grip, the wood soft with rot. She could pull it out with her bare hands if she wanted to. Start over, rebuild. But rebuild with what? With wood she didn't have? With nails she couldn't buy? With strength she'd already spent? She let go and stepped back, wiping her hands on her skirt. The mud from the storm still clung to the hem, dried and cracked, and she hadn't had the energy to wash it. Hadn't had the energy for much of anything. The notice from the sheriff still sat on the kitchen table, folded and forgotten. She hadn't looked at it since that night. Hadn't tried to find the man who bought the debt. What was the point? 30 days, the sheriff had said. 30 days to settle with the new owner, or lose everything. She had $12 to her name. $12 and a dying mother and a farm that was falling apart faster than she could hold it together. Clara closed her eyes and let the sun warm her face. For just a moment she let herself imagine walking away, leaving the fence broken, leaving the farm, leaving all of it behind, and just, "Ma'am?" The voice came from behind her, low and quiet, and Clara spun around so fast she nearly lost her balance. A man stood at the edge of the property, one hand resting on the reins of a dusty gray horse, the other holding his hat against his chest. He was tall, lean, with the kind of build that came from years of hard work and not enough food. His clothes were worn but clean, his face shadowed by the brim of the hat he'd just removed. But it was his eyes that stopped her, calm, steady. The kind of eyes that had seen too much and decided to be kind anyway. "Didn't mean to startle you," he said, his voice carrying just enough to reach her but no further. "Saw the fence was down. Thought you might need a hand." Clara stared at him, her heart still pounding from the surprise. She didn't recognize him, didn't know his face, and that alone was enough to make her wary. Strangers didn't just show up offering help, not in her experience. "I'm fine," she said, her voice harder than she meant it to be. "Don't need help." The man nodded slowly, like he'd expected that answer. Understood. He put his hat back on, tipped it toward her, and turned to leave. Clara watched him go, watched the way he moved, unhurried, unbothered, like he had all the time in the world and no place he needed to be. He reached his horse, gathered the reins, and swung up into the saddle with the kind of ease that came from a lifetime of riding. And then he paused, looked back at her. "Fence like that," he said, "won't last another week. Storm comes through, you'll lose more than posts." Clara felt her jaw tighten. "I know that. I'm sure you do." He adjusted his hat, squinting against the sun. But knowing and fixing are two different things. She wanted to tell him to leave, wanted to tell him she didn't need his advice or his pity or whatever it was he thought he was offering. But the words stuck in her throat, because he was right. The fence wouldn't last, and she didn't have the time or the strength to fix it alone. The man seemed to sense her hesitation. He dismounted, slow and careful, and walked back toward the fence lean, not toward her, but toward the broken posts. He crouched down, ran his hand along the base of one, tested the weight of another. "Wood's rotted through," he said, more to himself than to her. "But the wire's still good. You got any spare posts?" Clara crossed her arms. "Why do you care?" He looked up at her then, and for a moment she saw something flicker across his face, something that might have been sadness, or regret, or something else entirely. "Because I got time," he said simply, "and you look like you don't." The honesty of it caught her off guard. She didn't know what to say, didn't know if she should trust him or tell him to go to hell, so she just stood there, silent, while he waited. Finally, she sighed. "There's a few old posts behind the barn. Might be usable." The man nodded and stood, brushing the dirt from his hands. "I'll take a look." He walked past her without another word, his boots crunching on the dry grass, and Clara watched him go. This stranger who had appeared out of nowhere, and decided, for reasons she couldn't fathom, that her broken fence was worth fixing. She didn't move, didn't follow, just stood there in the sun, feeling the weight of his presence like something she couldn't name. His name was Eli Mercer, though she didn't learn that until later. He worked through the morning without speaking, pulling the old posts from behind the barn, testing each one for rot, setting aside the ones that might hold. Clara watched from the porch, pretending to mend a torn shirt but mostly just watching him move, efficient, deliberate, like a man who knew how to work and didn't need to prove it. By noon, he'd pulled out 3 of the broken posts and started digging new holes. The sun was high and merciless, and sweat darkened the back of his shirt, but he didn't stop. Didn't complain, just kept working, the rhythm of the shovel steady and sure. Clara brought him water without being asked, set the jar down on a flat rock near where he was working and stepped back, arms crossed. "You didn't have to do this," she said. Eli paused, leaning on the shovel, and reached for the water. He drank deep, then wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "I know, so why are you—" He looked at her, really looked at her, and she felt something shift in the air between them. "Maybe I just don't like seeing things fall apart when they don't have to." Clara frowned. "You don't even know me. Don't have to." He handed the jar back to her, their fingers brushing for just a second. "Some things are worth fixing whether you know them or not." She didn't know what to say to that. Didn't know if he was talking about the fence or something else entirely. So she just took the jar and walked back to the house, feeling his eyes on her the whole way. By the time the sun started to sink toward the horizon, the fence was standing again. Not perfect, not pretty, but standing. Eli straightened, rolling his shoulders, and stepped back to inspect his work. The posts were solid, driven deep into the ground, and the wire was taut and even. It would hold. For a while at least. Clara came out to look, her arms wrapped around herself against the cooling air. She stared at the fence, then at him, and for the first time all day, her expression softened. "Thank you," she said quietly. Eli nodded. "You're welcome." They stood there in the fading light, the valley stretching out before them, and neither of them spoke. There was nothing that needed to be said. The work was done, the fence was fixed, and something between them, something unspoken and fragile, had begun to take root. Finally, Eli picked up his hat from where he'd left it on a post and brushed the dust from the brim. "I should go—" "Wait!" Clara's voice stopped him. She hesitated, chewing her bottom lip, then took a breath. "I don't have much, but there's coffee, if you want—" Eli looked at her, surprise flickering across his face. Then, slowly, he smiled. It was a small smile, barely there, but it changed his whole face. Made him look younger, less tired. Coffee sounds good, he said. They walked to the house together, side by side, as the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky. And far off, in the distance, the wind moved through the valley like a whisper, soft, persistent, carrying the promise of something neither of them could see yet. But it was there, growing, waiting. The coffee was weak and bitter, but Eli drank it without complaint. They sat on the porch, Clara in her mother's old rocking chair, Eli on the steps with his back against the post. The night had settled in fully now, cool and quiet, and the only sounds were the creak of the chair and the distant call of an owl somewhere in the trees. "You live around here?" Clara asked, breaking the silence. Eli shook his head. "Just passing through to where?" He shrugged. "Wherever the road goes." Clara studied him, trying to understand. "That's no kind of life. It's the only kind, I know." She wanted to ask more, wanted to know where he'd come from, what he was running from, why a man who seemed so capable of building things spent his life drifting between them. But something in his expression told her not to push, told her that whatever he was carrying, he wasn't ready to set it down yet. So instead, she said, "The town's gonna talk. About you helping me." Eli glanced at her. "Let them talk. They'll say things. Make assumptions. They already are." He took another sip of coffee, his eyes distant. "People always do." Clara frowned. "Doesn't that bother you?" "Not as much as leaving that fence broken would have." There was a finality in his voice that ended the conversation, and Clara let it rest. They sat in silence for a while longer, the darkness wrapping around them like a blanket, and for the first time in months, Clara felt something other than exhaustion. She felt not quite safe, not quite hopeful, but close. When Eli finally stood to leave, he set the empty cup on the porch rail and looked at her one last time. "You need anything else, you let me know." Clara stood too, her arms wrapped around herself. "I don't even know your name." He paused, half-turned, toward his horse, and a faint smile crossed his lips. "Eli. Eli Mercer." "Clara Wren, I know." The words were soft, almost lost in the night air, but Clara heard them. And something about the way he said it, like he'd known all along, like he'd come here specifically for this, made her chest tighten. "Eli." But he was already walking away, already swinging up into the saddle, his silhouette dark against the starlit sky. He tipped his hat toward her one last time, and then he was gone, riding off into the darkness, the sound of hooves fading into the distance. Clara stood on the porch long after he disappeared, staring out at the valley, at the fixed fence, at the night that suddenly felt a little less heavy. Inside, her mother stirred, coughing softly, and Clara went to her, smoothing the blankets, checking her forehead, whispering words that didn't need to be heard to be true. "We're going to be okay. Somehow, we're going to be okay." And far off, riding through the dark with the weight of a secret still tucked inside his coat, Eli Mercer let himself believe it too. Because kindness, once planted, rarely stayed quiet, and soon it began to draw eyes they didn't want. The sun rose the next morning the way it always did, slow and golden, spilling light across the valley like honey poured from a jar. Clara woke to the sound of hammering. For a moment, she thought she was dreaming. Thought the exhaustion had finally cracked something inside her mind, and she was hearing things that weren't there. But then she heard it again. Steady, rhythmic, the unmistakable sound of a hammer striking wood. She threw off the thin blanket and went to the window, still in her nightdress, hair tangled around her shoulders. Through the dusty glass she could see him, Eli, standing by the barn, a plank of wood braced against his knee, driving nails with the kind of precision that came from years of practice. Clara's first instinct was irritation. She hadn't asked him to come back, hadn't given him permission to keep working. But even as the thought formed, she felt it soften, dissolve into something closer to gratitude. She dressed quickly, braided her hair without looking in the mirror, and walked outside. The morning air was cool, carrying the scent of sage and dry earth. Eli looked up as she approached. Hammer paused mid-swing and nodded once, a greeting that required no words. "You're back," Clara said, her voice still rough with sleep. "Barn roof's got holes," Eli replied simply. "Rain comes again. You'll lose whatever you're storing in there." Clara glanced up at the roof. He was right. She'd noticed the leaks months ago, had put buckets underneath to catch the drips, but she'd never had the time or materials to fix it properly. "I didn't ask you to do this," she said, though there was no anger in it, just confusion. Eli set the hammer down and wiped his hands on his pants. I know. So why? Because it needs doing. He picked up another plank, measuring it against the gap in the roof. And because I got time. There was that phrase again. I got time. Like time was something he had in abundance, something he could afford to give away without counting the cost. Clara wanted to argue, wanted to tell him she didn't need charity, didn't need a stranger fixing her life one broken thing at a time. But the words wouldn't come, because the truth was, she did need help, had needed it for months. And here it was, standing in front of her with dust on his boots and kindness in his eyes. There's coffee, she said finally. When you're ready. Eli glanced at her, and for just a moment something warm flickered across his face. Appreciated. Clara turned to go, then paused. Eli? Yeah, thank you. He didn't answer. Just picked up the hammer and went back to work, the sound of it following her all the way back to the house. The days began to blur together after that, each one bleeding into the next in a rhythm that felt both strange and natural. Eli came at dawn and worked until dusk, moving from one task to the next without needing to be asked. He fixed the barn roof, patched the holes in the chicken coop, replaced the rotted boards on the porch steps. He worked quietly, speaking only when necessary, but his presence filled the spaces around him, steady, solid, like a foundation that had been missing for too long. Clara tried to pay him, offered him the last of her savings, the $12 she'd been hoarding for emergencies. But Eli just shook his head, his expression unreadable. Keep it, he said. You'll need it more than me. I can't just let you work for nothing. Then don't think of it as nothing. He handed her a bucket he'd just repaired, the handle newly lashed with strong cord. Think of it as something that needed doing. She didn't know how to argue with that. Didn't know how to argue with a man who seemed to measure worth in things other than money. So she stopped trying. Instead, she fed him, made him breakfast when he arrived, eggs when they had them, biscuits when they didn't, coffee always. He ate without complaint, without expectation, and when he was done, he'd set the plate in the basin and go back to work. Sometimes, Clara worked beside him, held the ladder while he climbed, passed him nails when his hands were full. They didn't talk much during those moments. But the silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that came from shared purpose, from two people learning the rhythm of each other's movements without needing words to guide them. And slowly, so slowly Clara almost didn't notice, the farm began to change. The fence stood straight and strong. The barn roof no longer leaked. The porch steps didn't creak underfoot. Small things, quiet things, but together, they added up to something that felt almost like hope. It was late afternoon when Clara's mother finally spoke of him. Clara was inside, kneading dough for bread, flour dusting her hands and apron. Her mother sat in the chair by the window, wrapped in quilts despite the warmth of the day, watching the world outside with eyes that saw more than they should. He's a good man, her mother said softly, her voice barely more than a whisper. Clara didn't look up. Who? Don't play dumb with me, girl. You know who. Clara's hands stilled in the dough. He's just helping. That's all. Her mother made a sound that might have been agreement, or might have been something else entirely. Men don't help like that unless they got a reason. Maybe he's just kind. Kind men are rare, Clara. Kind men with no expectation are even rarer. Her mother coughed, a wet rattling sound that made Clara's chest tighten. When she caught her breath, again she continued. You be careful. Clara finally looked at her. Careful of what? Her mother's eyes, still sharp despite the illness eating away at her, met Clara's with an intensity that felt like a warning. Of thinking kindness comes without cost, of letting yourself lean on something that might not stay. The words settled between them, heavy and true, and Clara felt something twist inside her chest. Because her mother was right, she was leaning, was starting to rely on Eli's presence, on the sound of his hammer in the morning, on the way he looked at her like she was worth more than the sum of her debts. And that was dangerous, because men like Eli didn't stay. Men who drifted through towns without roots or reasons didn't plant themselves in broken places and call them home. I know, Clara said quietly, turning back to the dough. I know, Mama. But even as she said it, she felt the lie in it. Because part of her, a part she didn't want to name, was already hoping he would stay. The town noticed, of course. Small towns always did. Clara went into town 3 days after Eli had started working the farm, riding the mare into the dusty main street to buy flour and coffee and whatever else she could afford. She tied the horse outside the general store and stepped inside, the bell above the door chiming softly. The store was dim and cool, shelves lined with jars and sacks and tools. Mr. Brennan stood behind the counter, a heavy man with a beard like wire and eyes that missed nothing. "Miss Wren," he said, his voice flat. Not unkind, but not warm either. "Mr. Brennan." Clara set her basket on the counter. "I need flour, 5 pounds if you have it." "Got it." He turned to pull the sack from the shelf, and Clara heard the whispers before she saw the women. 2 of them, standing near the back of the store, half hidden behind a display of fabric. Mrs. Coulter and Mrs. Hayes, both dressed in their Sunday clothes despite it being a Wednesday, both watching her with the kind of eyes that stripped a person down to gossip and judgment. "I heard he's been there near a week now," Mrs. Hayes said, her voice low but not low enough. "Scandalous," Mrs. Coulter replied. "A man and a woman alone on that farm, and her poor mother too sick to chaperone. Maybe he's family? She doesn't have family. Not since her father passed." Clara felt her jaw tighten, but she didn't turn around, didn't give them the satisfaction. Mr. Brennan set the flour on the counter, his expression carefully neutral. "Anything else?" "Coffee," Clara said. "Half a pound." He nodded and turned away again, and Clara forced herself to breathe, to ignore the whispers, to pretend she didn't care what they thought. But she did care, not for herself, but for Eli. Because gossip had a way of poisoning good things, and she didn't want his kindness to be twisted into something ugly. When she left the store, the flour and coffee tucked into her saddlebag, she saw them. 3 men standing outside the saloon, watching her with expressions that ranged from curiosity to something darker. One of them, a lean man with a scar across his cheek, tipped his hat mockingly. "Heard you got yourself some help out there, Miss Wren." Clara kept walking, eyes forward. "Must be nice," he continued, his voice carrying across the street. "Having a man to do the work for you makes a person wonder what he's getting in return." Clara stopped, turned, looked him dead in the eye. "He's getting nothing but the satisfaction of being a decent human being. You should try it sometime." The man's smile faded, and for a moment the street was silent. Then Clara climbed onto her horse and rode away, her back straight, her heart pounding. She told Eli about it that evening, after the sun had set, and they were sitting on the porch with coffee, and the sounds of crickets filling the air. "People are talking," she said, staring out at the darkening valley. Eli nodded slowly. "I figured they would. Doesn't bother you? I've been talked about before." He took a sip of coffee, his expression unreadable. "Talking doesn't change what's true." Clara glanced at him. "And what's true?" Eli met her eyes, and for a moment the world seemed to hold its breath. "That you needed help, and I was able to give it. That's all." "Is it?" The question hung between them, weighted with things neither of them knew how to say. Eli looked away first, setting his cup down carefully. "I should go," he said quietly. Clara wanted to stop him, wanted to say something that would make him stay, that would push past the careful distance they both kept. But she didn't know what that something was, so she just nodded. "Good night, Eli." "Good night, Clara." He rode off into the dark, and Clara sat alone on the porch, feeling the weight of her mother's warning, and the pull of something she couldn't name. Inside, her mother coughed, and Clara went to her, smoothing her hair, adjusting her pillows, whispering reassurances that felt more like prayers. Summer deepened. The days grew longer, hotter, the sun beating down on the valley until even the shade felt like an oven. But the work continued. Eli showed up every morning, steady as sunrise, and together they turned the failing farm into something that almost looked like it could survive. They planted what they could: beans, squash, a few rows of corn. Eli taught her how to brace the irrigation ditches so the water wouldn't run off, how to build a trellis for the beans that would last more than one season. He worked with his hands and his back, but also with his mind, thinking 3 steps ahead, planning for problems before they arrived. And slowly, Clara began to understand that this quiet, methodical fixing of broken things, was how Eli spoke. Not with words, but with actions. Not with promises, but with presence. One afternoon, when the heat was at its worst, and they were both drenched in sweat, Eli looked up from the ditch he was digging and said, "You ever think about leaving?" Clara, sitting in the shade with a jar of water, frowned. "Leaving where?" "Here, the farm. All of it." She considered the question, turning it over in her mind. Every day, she admitted. But where would I go? This is all I know. Eli nodded, like he understood. Sometimes staying is harder than leaving. Is that why you don't? He didn't answer. Just went back to digging, the shovel biting into the dry earth with steady, rhythmic strokes. Clara watched him, this man who had appeared out of nowhere and stayed for reasons he wouldn't name, and felt something shift inside her chest. Something that felt like trust, or maybe something deeper. Eli? Yeah? Why are you really here? He paused, leaning on the shovel, and looked at her with those calm, steady eyes that always seemed to carry more than they showed. For a long moment, he didn't speak. Then quietly he said, "Because I got tired of running from things I could fix." It wasn't a full answer, but it was enough. The evening came, painted in shades of orange and gold. They finished the irrigation work and walked back to the house together, boots heavy with mud, clothes stained with dirt and sweat. Clara's mother was asleep in her chair, her breathing shallow but steady, and Clara covered her gently with a quilt before joining Eli on the porch. He'd washed his hands in the basin, was drying them on a rag when Clara came out. She handed him a cup of coffee, stronger this time, better, and he took it with a nod of thanks. They sat in the fading light, watching the sun sink below the hills, and for once, neither of them felt the need to fill the silence with words. The crickets sang. The wind moved through the grass. The valley stretched out before them, vast and quiet, and somehow less lonely than it had been before. And in that moment, Clara let herself believe, just for a heartbeat, that this could last. That the man sitting beside her, the one who fixed fences and roofs and broken things, might stay. She didn't say it, didn't dare speak it into existence, but Eli must have felt it too, because he glanced at her, and in the dying light, she saw something in his expression that looked almost like regret, like he knew already that staying wasn't something he'd earned the right to do. Inside his coat pocket, folded and worn, the paper with her mother's signature seemed to grow heavier. The debt he'd bought, the secret he carried, the thing that bound him to her and would eventually tear them apart. But for now, for this one golden evening, Eli let himself sit beside her and pretend he was just a drifter who'd stopped to help, pretend the debt didn't exist, pretend that kindness didn't have a price. The sun disappeared behind the hills and the stars began to appear one by one, like promises written in light. And far off, carried on the wind, came the distant sound of thunder, soft, warning, inevitable. Because as summer faded and papers changed hands again, the secret that bound them began to tremble. The dust came first. Clara saw it from the garden, where she was kneeling between rows of beans that had finally begun to climb their trellises. A brown cloud rising from the road, moving slow and deliberate, catching the late morning light like smoke. She stood, wiping her hands on her apron, and watched it grow closer. 3 riders, maybe 4, her stomach tightened. Riders in groups never brought good news. Behind her, she heard the sound of Eli's hammer pause. He'd been working on the chicken coop, replacing the last of the rotted slats, but now he was standing too. Hat pushed back, eyes fixed on the approaching dust. "You expecting anyone?" he asked quietly. Clara shook her head. "No." The riders came into focus as they crossed onto the property. 4 men, all of them familiar in the way small-town faces always were. The sheriff was in front, his star catching the sunlight. Behind him rode Mr. Brennan from the general store, old Mr. Patterson who owned the bank, and a younger man Clara recognized but couldn't name. Someone's son, maybe, with the kind of face that blended into crowds. They reined up near the house, horses snorting and stamping, and the sheriff dismounted with the stiff movements of a man who spent too much time in the saddle. "Miss Wren," he said, touching the brim of his hat. His eyes flicked to Eli, then back to her. "Got a moment?" Clara crossed her arms, feeling the weight of their stares. "What's this about?" The sheriff glanced at Mr. Patterson, who dismounted as well, pulling a leather folder from his saddlebag. The banker was a thin man with spectacles that sat crooked on his nose in a way of looking at people that made them feel like numbers in a ledger. "It's about your mother's debt, Mr. Patterson said, his voice clipped and businesslike. "Or rather, the transfer of it." Clara felt her heart begin to pound. "I know about the transfer. Sheriff told me weeks ago." "Yes, well," Mr. Patterson adjusted his spectacles. "There's been some confusion. Questions raised about the buyer's identity. What kind of questions? The banker looked uncomfortable now, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. The kind that require answers. The man who bought your debt, he never left a proper name. Just paid in cash and signed the papers. Bank policy requires. His name's Eli Mercer. The words came from behind her, quiet and steady, and Clara turned to see Eli walking toward them, the hammer still in his hand. His expression was calm, but something in his eyes had changed, something that looked like resignation. The sheriff straightened. That right? Eli nodded. That's right. The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. Clara stared at him, her mind trying to process what he just said, trying to make the words make sense. The man who bought your debt. Eli Mercer. You? Her voice came out barely more than a whisper. Eli's eyes met hers, and she saw everything in them. The guilt, the sorrow, the weight of the secret he'd been carrying. Yeah, he said softly. Me. The world tilted. Clara felt the ground shift beneath her feet, felt the air turn to something solid and suffocating. All this time, all these weeks, he'd been here, working, helping, sitting beside her on the porch, and he'd owned her. You. She couldn't finish. Couldn't find words big enough to hold what she was feeling. Mr. Brennan spoke up from his horse, his voice carrying across the yard. Told you, Sheriff, been saying it for days. Man doesn't work that hard for nothing. He bought the debt so I could what? Eli turned to face them, his voice still quiet but edged with something harder now. So I could what, exactly? Mr. Brennan's face reddened. So you could have leverage. So you could, hell, I don't know, but a man doesn't buy a woman's debt out of kindness. Not in the real world. Then maybe you don't know what kindness looks like. The sheriff held up a hand. Everybody calmed down. He looked at Eli, his expression unreadable. You bought the debt 3 months ago, paid in full, $840. That true? It's true. And you never told her? No, why not? Eli was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working like he was chewing on words he didn't know how to swallow. Finally, he said, because she didn't need to know. She just needed to breathe again. Clara made a sound, something between a laugh and a sob. Didn't need to know? You bought my mother's debt and you didn't think I needed to know? Eli turned to her, and the look on his face nearly broke her. I just wanted you to be free of it. I wasn't going to collect. Wasn't going to claim anything. He stopped, shaking his head. I just wanted you to have a chance. A chance. Clara's voice was rising now, all the fear and anger and betrayal pouring out of her in a flood. You've been lying to me for weeks. Working here, acting like you were just some drifter who wanted to help, when all along you owned everything I have. I never wanted to own anything, Eli said, his voice rough. I wanted to give it back. Then why didn't you? She was shouting now, tears streaming down her face. Why didn't you just tell me? Why did you have to? She couldn't finish. Couldn't put into words the depth of the betrayal, the way it felt like everything good that had been growing between them had been built on a foundation of lies. The sheriff stepped forward, his hand raised. Miss Wren, I understand you're upset, but you don't understand anything. Clara whirled on him, on all of them. None of you do. You want to know why he's here? It's because none of you were. Because when my mother was dying and the bank was taking everything, not one of you lifted a finger to help. So don't you dare stand there and judge him for doing what none of you had the decency to do. The words echoed across the yard, sharp and true, and the men shifted uncomfortably in their saddles. Mr. Patterson cleared his throat. Be that as it may, there are legal questions that need... Legal questions? Clara laughed, bitter and broken. Fine. What do you need? The banker pulled out a paper from his folder. We need Mr. Mercer to formally state his intentions regarding the debt, whether he intends to collect, to foreclose, or to forgive it, Eli said quietly. Everyone turned to look at him. I'm forgiving it, Eli continued, his eyes never leaving Clara's face. The debt, the interest, all of it. I don't want her money. Never did. Mr. Patterson blinked. You're forgiving $840, plus interest, whatever it adds up to. I'm forgiving all of it. That's... The banker seemed at a loss for words. That's highly irregular. I don't care. The sheriff studied Eli for a long moment, his eyes narrowed. You're serious. Dead serious. Why? Eli finally looked away from Clara, his shoulders sagging slightly. Because it's the right thing to do. Because she doesn't owe me anything. Never did. Mr. Patterson shook his head slowly, like he was witnessing something that violated every principle he'd ever held. I'll need documentation, papers signed. This will take— Then get the papers, Eli said. I'll sign whatever you need. The banker nodded stiffly and remounted his horse. The others followed suit, except for the sheriff, who paused before swinging up into his saddle. For what it's worth, he said quietly, looking at Eli. I believe you. About your intentions. He glanced at Clara. But belief doesn't always make things right. Then he was gone, the four of them riding back toward town, leaving a wake of dust that hung in the air like accusation. Clara and Eli stood in the yard, 10 feet apart, the distance between them feeling like miles. Clara, Eli started, his voice cracking. Don't. She held up a hand, her whole body shaking. Just don't. Please, let me explain. Explain what? She laughed, bitter and hollow. Explain how you lied to me? How you let me think you were just some kind stranger when all along you owned the roof over my head? How you sat beside me, drank coffee with me, worked beside me, all while keeping this secret. I never lied to you. You never told me the truth. That's the same thing. Eli flinched like she'd struck him. I know it was wrong. But I didn't know how to tell you without what? Without me feeling exactly like I feel right now? Like I've been played for a fool? Like everything between us was just— Her voice broke. Like it was all just you feeling sorry for me? It wasn't like that. Then what was it like, Eli? She was crying openly now, her face flushed and her eyes burning. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you bought my debt so you could play the hero. So you could swoop in and save the poor helpless widow's daughter and feel good about yourself. No. Eli's voice was rough, almost desperate. No, Clara, that's not— I did it because I've spent my whole life running from things I couldn't fix, from debts I couldn't pay, from mistakes I couldn't undo, and when I heard about you, about what you were going through— He stopped, swallowing hard. I just wanted to do one thing right, one thing that mattered. Then why not just tell me? Because I didn't want you to feel like you owed me. I didn't want you to look at me the way you're looking at me right now, like I'm just another man trying to take something from you. But you did take something, Clara shouted. You took my trust. You took the one thing that was starting to feel real and you turned it into this. She gestured wildly at the space between them, at the yard, at everything. Eli stood there, shoulders slumped, the hammer hanging loose in his hand. He looked older suddenly, tired in a way that went deeper than physical exhaustion. I'm sorry, he said finally, his voice barely audible. I'm so sorry, Clara. Clara closed her eyes, trying to hold herself together. I want you to leave. Clara, leave. The word came out as a scream, raw and jagged. Get off my property. Get out of my sight. I don't want your help. I don't want your money, and I don't want you. The silence that followed was absolute. Eli nodded slowly, like he'd been expecting this, like he'd known all along it would end this way. He set the hammer down carefully on the porch steps, then walked to his horse, every movement heavy with defeat. He mounted without looking back, gathered the reins and paused, just for a moment, like he wanted to say something else, but whatever it was, he kept it to himself. Then he rode away. Clara stood in the yard and watched him go, watched the dust rise behind him, watched until he was nothing but a small, dark shape against the horizon, and then she fell to her knees in the dirt and sobbed, great, heaving sobs that came from somewhere deep and broken inside her. Sobbed for the loss of something she'd barely had time to name. Sobbed for the betrayal and the kindness and the impossible tangle of both. Sobbed because she'd let herself hope. And hope, it turned out, was the cruelest thing of all. Inside the house, her mother stirred, waking from restless sleep. She looked out the window, saw Clara kneeling in the dirt, and understood immediately what had happened. "Oh, child," she whispered to the empty room. "Oh, my dear, foolish child," because she'd seen this coming, had seen the way they looked at each other, the way silence had turned to comfort, the way two broken people had started to fit themselves together like pieces of something whole. And she'd known, the way mothers always know, that truth had a way of ruining beautiful things. She closed her eyes and whispered a prayer for them both, for her daughter, who'd been hurt in the name of kindness, and for the man who'd ridden away, carrying more weight than when he'd arrived. That night, the stars came out cold and distant. Clara sat on the porch with a letter in her hands, one Eli had left tucked under the hammer, weighted, down with a stone so the wind wouldn't take it. She'd found it hours after he'd gone, after the sun had set and the world had turned gray and empty. She should burn it, should tear it into pieces and scatter them to the wind, should do anything but read it. But her hands were already unfolding it, and her eyes were already finding the words, written in a careful, deliberate hand. Clara, I know sorry isn't enough. Know that words can't undo what I did or didn't do. But I need you to understand, I never wanted to hurt you, never wanted you to feel like you owed me anything. I bought the debt because I'd heard your story 2 towns back. Heard about your mother, heard about how you were holding everything together with nothing but will and stubbornness, and I thought, if I could just take that weight off your shoulders, just give you room to breathe, maybe that would be enough. I didn't plan on staying, didn't plan on working the farm or fixing fences or any of it, but then I saw you that first day, saw the way you carried yourself even when you were breaking, and I couldn't leave. Couldn't right away knowing you were doing it all alone. So I stayed, and I kept the secret because I was a coward. Because I knew if you found out, you'd look at me exactly the way you looked at me today. The debt is forgiven, the papers will be signed, the farm is yours, free and clear. That was always the plan. I just wish I'd been brave enough to tell you myself. I'm sorry for the lie, I'm sorry for the hurt, and I'm sorry I couldn't be the man you deserved, one who gave you truth along with kindness. But I'm not sorry I helped, and I'm not sorry I met you. Some things are worth the cost. Clara read it 3 times, the words blurring through her tears, and by the 3rd time, something had shifted. Not forgiveness, not yet, but something softer, something that felt like understanding. He'd been wrong, terribly, painfully wrong, but he'd also been kind, and kindness, real kindness, was so rare in this world that maybe, just maybe, it deserved more than her anger. She folded the letter carefully and tucked it into her pocket, then looked out at the dark valley where somewhere, miles away, a man was riding through the night carrying the weight of his mistakes. And for the first time since the truth had come out, Clara let herself wonder, what if kindness wasn't the lie? What if the lie had been told in service of something true? The thought was too big to hold, too complicated to untangle in one night, so she set it aside and went inside to tend to her mother, who was coughing again, worse than before. The stars kept their vigil overhead, cold and clear, bearing witness to the space between mercy and judgment. And in that space, something was beginning to shift, slowly, like winter turning toward spring. But love doesn't end in anger. It waits in the quiet, asking to be understood. The first frost came early that year. Clara woke to find the world transformed. Every blade of grass silver white, every fence post crowned with ice, the whole valley glittering under a pale dawn sky that promised cold and little else. She stood at the window in her nightdress, arms wrapped around herself, and watched her breath fog the glass. Outside, the farm looked peaceful, deceptive, like the frost had covered all the broken places and made them beautiful. But beauty didn't fix anything, didn't fill the silence that had settled over the house like snow. Behind her, in the bed by the fire, her mother's breathing rattled, wet and labored, each exhale sounding like it might be the last. 3 weeks had passed since the day the truth rode in. 3 weeks since Eli had left. 3 weeks of Clara working alone, her hands cracked and bleeding from the cold, her body moving through the motions of survival without really feeling any of it. The debt was gone. The papers had arrived a week after that terrible day, delivered by Mr. Patterson himself, who'd looked almost embarrassed as he handed them over. Signed, notarized, official. The farm was hers, free and clear. She should have felt relief, should have felt the weight lift from her shoulders the way Eli had intended. But all she felt was empty. She dressed in the cold, layering every piece of clothing she owned, and went outside to feed the animals. The chickens huddled together in their coop, their feathers fluffed against the chill. The mare stood in the barn, her breath steaming in the dim light, and nudged Clara's shoulder as if asking where the quiet man with gentle hands had gone. Clara didn't have an answer, not for the horse, not for herself. She worked through the morning, hauling water, mending the tears in the chicken wire that the wind had made, checking the stores of hay and grain that would have to last through winter. Every task felt heavier than it should, every moment stretched longer. By noon the sun had burned through the frost, but the cold remained, deep and persistent, the kind that settled into bones and didn't let go. Clara went inside to check on her mother and found her awake, her eyes open but distant, focused on something beyond the ceiling. "Mama?" Clara knelt beside the bed, taking her mother's hand. It was so thin now, so fragile, like bird bones wrapped in paper. Her mother's eyes shifted slowly, focusing on Clara's face. "He's gone," she whispered. Clara nodded, her throat tight. "Yes." "Did you tell him to go?" "Yes." Her mother was quiet for a long moment, her breathing labored. Then, with effort, she squeezed Clara's hand. "Foolish girl." Clara felt tears prick her eyes. "He lied to me, Mama. He saved you. He should have told me. Maybe." Her mother coughed, a terrible sound that shook her whole frame. When she caught her breath again, her voice was weaker. "But sometimes, the way we save people isn't the way they want to be saved. Doesn't make it less true." Clara bent forward, pressing her forehead to her mother's hand. "I don't know what to do." "Yes, you do." Her mother's fingers moved weakly through Clara's hair, the way they had when she was a child. "You just don't want to do it." Before Clara could respond, another coughing fit seized her mother, worse this time, violent enough that Clara had to hold her upright, had to feel the way her mother's body convulsed with each breath. When it finally passed, her mother slumped back against the pillows, her face ashen, her lips tinged with blue. "Mama!" Clara's voice cracked with fear. But her mother was already drifting, her eyes closing, her breathing settling into a rhythm that sounded too much like surrender. Clara sat beside her for hours, holding her hand, whispering prayers and promises she wasn't sure she could keep. 200 miles north, in a logging camp carved from the wilderness, Eli Mercer swung an axe. The blade bit into frozen wood with a sound like a gunshot, and he felt the impact travel up his arms, into his shoulders, into the parts of him that hurt in ways that had nothing to do with labor. He'd been here 5 days, 5 days of work that started before dawn and ended after dark, 5 days of sleeping in a rough bunkhouse with 20 other men who smelled of sweat and pine sap and whiskey, 5 days of trying to outrun the look on Clara's face when she'd told him to leave. It wasn't working. The foreman, a barrel-chested man named Hank, walked past and paused. "You trying to kill that tree or yourself?" Eli straightened, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the cold. "Tree's already dead. So are you. You keep working like that." Hank spat tobacco juice into the snow. "What are you running from, Mercer?" Eli didn't answer, just raised the axe and swung again. At night, in the bunkhouse, he lay on his cot and stared at the ceiling while the other men played cards and argued and laughed about things that didn't matter. He tried not to think about Clara, tried not to imagine her working the farm alone, tried not to wonder if she'd read his letter or burned it. But the trying was useless. She was there in every quiet moment, in the way the firelight flickered on the walls, in the sound of wind through the pines, in the empty spaces between one breath and the next. He'd done the right thing. He knew he had given her back her freedom, her dignity, her life. So why did it feel like he'd lost something instead? One night, a week after he'd arrived at the camp, Eli pulled out the letter he'd started writing a dozen times and never finished. "Clara, I don't expect you to forgive me." He stopped, crossed it out, started again. "Clara, I hope the farm is..." Crossed it out. "Clara, I'm sorry." He stared at those 2 words for a long time, then folded the paper and shoved it back into his pocket. What was the point? Sorry didn't change what he'd done, didn't make the lie less of a lie. He lay back on the cot and closed his eyes, listening to the sounds of men living and the wind howling through the gaps in the walls. And for the first time in years, Eli Mercer let himself feel the full weight of his loneliness. Back in the valley, winter deepened. Snow came in late November, soft at first, then harder, piling up against the barn and the house until Clara had to shovel paths just to move between them. The cold was relentless, seeping through every crack, turning the inside of the house into a place where breath became visible and fingers went numb even near the fire. Clara's mother grew weaker by the day. The coughing fits came more often, lasted longer, left her gasping and pale. The medicine the doctor had left was long gone, and there was no money for more. No money for anything except the bare essentials: flour, salt, coffee when she could afford it. Clara tried to keep the fire burning, tried to keep her mother warm and fed and comfortable, but she could feel it slipping away. Her mother's strength, her mother's life, her mother's presence. On a gray afternoon in early December, her mother opened her eyes and looked at Clara with a clarity that hadn't been there in weeks. "You need to find him," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Clara was sitting beside the bed, mending a shirt by the weak light from the window. She looked up, confused. "Find who, Mama?" "Eli," Clara's hand stilled. "Mama, find him." Her mother's voice was weak but insistent. "Before it's too late." "Too late for what?" Her mother reached out, her thin fingers grasping Clara's hand with surprising strength. "To tell him, you understand. To tell him, you forgive." "I don't know if I do," Clara whispered. Her mother's eyes, still sharp despite everything, fixed on Clara's face. "Yes, you do. You're just too stubborn to admit it." She coughed, a wet, terrible sound. "Don't be like me, child. Don't let pride steal what matters. What if he doesn't want to hear it? Then you'll know. You tried." Her mother's grip loosened, her eyes drifting closed. "But I think he'll want to hear it." Clara sat there, her mother's hand in hers, and felt something crack open inside her chest. All these weeks she'd been holding onto her anger like it was a shield, like it was the only thing protecting her from the hurt. But her mother was dying, and anger, she was learning, was a cold companion. That night, after her mother had fallen into restless sleep, Clara pulled out Eli's letter and read it again by candlelight. "I just wish I'd been brave enough to tell you myself." She traced the words with her finger, feeling the indent of the pen on the paper, imagining him writing this, alone somewhere, probably full of the same hurt and confusion she'd been carrying. He'd been wrong. There was no denying that. But he'd also been more right than anyone else had been. More right than the town that had turned its back. More right than the bank that had bought her mother's suffering. More right than Clara herself, who'd been too proud to ask for help. He'd given her everything and asked for nothing in return, and she'd sent him away. Clara folded the letter carefully, tucked it against her heart, and made a decision. Her mother died 3 days before Christmas. It happened quietly, in the hour before dawn, when the world was still and dark and waiting for light. Clara was asleep in the chair beside the bed, exhausted from days of barely sleeping, and when she woke, she knew immediately. The room was too quiet. The breathing that had been her constant companion for months, labored, rattling, present, was gone. "Mama?" Clara reached for her mother's hand and found it cold. She didn't cry, not at first, just sat there, holding her mother's hand, feeling the weight of absence settle over her like snow. Her mother looked peaceful, more peaceful than she had in years. The lines of pain that had etched themselves into her face were smoothed away, and in the gray dawn light, she looked almost young again. Clara finally let go and stood, her body numb, her mind strangely clear. There were things that needed to be done, people to notify, arrangements to make. But first, she needed to say goodbye. She washed her mother's body with care, dressed her in her best dress, the one she'd worn to Clara's father's funeral years ago, and braided her hair the way she used to wear it. She placed her mother's hands over her chest and whispered all the things she should have said, when there was still time to hear them. "Thank you. I love you. I'm sorry. Goodbye." Then she covered her mother's face with a clean white cloth and walked outside into the cold. The sun was rising, pale and distant, and the valley was covered in fresh snow that sparkled like broken glass. Clara stood on the porch and looked out at the world her mother would never see again, and finally, the tears came. She cried for her mother, for the life that had been too hard and too short, for all the things that would never be said or done or shared, and she cried for herself, for the loneliness that stretched out before her like an endless winter. But somewhere, beneath the grief, something else was stirring, something that felt like resolve. Her mother's last words echoed in her mind. "Find him, tell him you forgive." Clara wiped her tears and went back inside. She had a funeral to arrange. Had to notify the preacher, had to dig a grave in frozen ground, had to do all the things that came with death. But after that, she would ride north. The funeral was small, just Clara, the preacher, and a handful of townspeople who came more out of obligation than genuine grief. They stood in the cold while the preacher spoke words Clara didn't hear, and then they lowered her mother into the ground beside her father's grave. Clara stood alone as the first shovelful of dirt hit the coffin, and she felt something inside her break cleanly in two, the part of her that had been her mother's daughter, and the part that was now just Clara, alone in the world. When it was over and the townspeople had drifted away, Clara stayed until the grave was filled and marked with a simple wooden cross, stayed until the sun began to set, and the cold became unbearable. Then she went home, packed a bag with everything she'd need, and saddled the mare. She left at dawn the next morning, riding north through snow and silence, following the rumors she'd heard about a logging camp in the mountains where drifters went to work when they had nowhere else to go. It took her 2 days of hard riding, sleeping in barns and under trees, living on jerky and melted snow. The cold cut through every layer she wore, and her hands went numb on the reins, but she didn't stop, because her mother had been right. Pride was a cold companion, and Clara was done being cold. She found the camp on the 3rd day, just as another storm was rolling in. It was exactly as she'd imagined. Rough buildings, men moving like shadows through the smoke and snow, the sound of axes and saws and cursing filling the air. Clara rode in slowly, feeling the eyes of the workers on her. A woman alone was rare in places like this, rare and unwelcome. She found the foreman outside the largest building and dismounted, her legs shaking from the cold and exhaustion. "I'm looking for someone," she said, her voice hoarse. "Eli Mercer." "Is he here?" The foreman, Hank, studied her with narrowed eyes. "Who's asking?" "Someone who needs to talk to him." Hank spat into the snow. "He's down by the river, clearing ice from the log jam." Clara nodded and started to turn away, but Hank's voice stopped her. "Fair warning, miss. He ain't the same man who arrived here. Whatever he left behind, it's eating him alive." Clara met his eyes. "I know." She found him exactly where Hank said he'd be, knee-deep in icy water, using a pole to push against a massive log that had gotten wedged against the rocks. His coat was soaked, his hands red and raw, and even from a distance, she could see he was shaking from the cold. But he kept working, kept pushing, like if he just worked hard enough he could push away whatever was haunting him. Eli. His name came out barely louder than the wind, but he heard it. She saw him freeze, saw the way his whole body went rigid. Slowly he turned. Their eyes met across the frozen riverbank, and Clara saw everything she needed to see. The shock, the hope, the fear, the love. All of it written across his face like words on a page. "Clara?" His voice broke on her name. She didn't answer, just waded into the water, the cold shocking her system, stealing her breath. She didn't care about the water or the cold or anything, except reaching him. When she got close enough, she saw the question in his eyes, the desperate, aching need to understand why she was there. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice shaking. "I'm so sorry, Eli." He shook his head, water dripping from his hair. No, Clara, you don't have to." "Yes, I do." She was crying now, the tears hot against her frozen cheeks. "You bought my debt. You gave me my life back. And I threw it in your face. I threw you away, and I—" Her voice broke. "My mother died. She died, and her last words were to find you, to tell you I understand, to tell you—" She couldn't finish. The words were stuck, tangled up with grief and cold and the overwhelming weight of everything she'd been carrying. But Eli understood. She saw it in his eyes, the way they softened, the way they filled with tears that matched her own. He dropped the pole and pulled her against him, his arms wrapping around her. And Clara felt something inside her finally settle. "I'm sorry," she whispered against his chest. "I'm so sorry." "No." His voice was rough, choked. Don't ever be sorry. I'm the one who—" "You gave me back my dignity," Clara interrupted, pulling back just enough to look at him. "You bought my debt, but you gave me my dignity. Do you understand that?" Eli stared at her, and she saw the moment the words reached him, saw the way his expression shifted from guilt to something that looked almost like wonder. "I never wanted to own anything," he said quietly. "I just wanted to give you back your soul. Then you gave me back mine too," Clara whispered. They stood there in the freezing water, holding each other, and for the first time since that terrible day in autumn, the world felt right again. Above them, the storm finally broke, snow falling soft and thick, covering the mountains, covering them, covering everything in white. And in that whiteness, in that moment of perfect stillness, two people who'd been broken by kindness and lies and all the complicated spaces between them finally found their way back to each other. Not through grand gestures, not through perfect words, but through the simple, stubborn act of showing up, of being brave enough to say, "I was wrong. I understand now. Please don't go." When spring returned to the valley, so would they, not as strangers but as something new, something forged in winter and made stronger by the cold, something that looked, finally, like home. The storm came down like judgment. Clara and Eli stood in the river, water swirling around their knees, arms wrapped around each other, and watched the sky darken from gray to black in the span of a heartbeat. The wind picked up, howling through the canyon like something alive, and the snow that had been falling soft and gentle turned hard and cutting. "We need to get out of this water," Eli shouted over the wind, his voice barely carrying. Clara nodded, her teeth already chattering, and together they struggled toward the bank. The current fought them, stronger now, fed by runoff from upstream, and Clara felt her feet slip on the rocks beneath her. Eli's arm tightened around her waist, keeping her upright, and they pushed forward until finally, they reached solid ground. But solid ground offered no shelter. The wind tore through the canyon and the temperature was dropping fast, faster than Clara had ever felt it fall. Her wet clothes were already freezing, stiffening against her skin, and her hands had gone numb. "The camp," she started, but Eli was already shaking his head. "Too far. We'll never make it in this." He looked around wildly, squinting against the snow, then grabbed her hand. "There. Old Trapper's cabin. I saw it last week. Come on." They ran, or tried to. The snow was already deep enough to slow them, and Clara's legs felt like lead, heavy and unresponsive. Behind them, she heard a crack like thunder, a tree coming down somewhere in the forest, crushed under the weight of ice and wind. Eli pulled her forward, his grip on her hand the only thing keeping her tethered to the world. The cold was absolute now, suffocating, and Clara felt her vision starting to narrow, her thoughts turning slow and fuzzy. "This is how people die in storms," some distant part of her mind observed calmly. "They get turned around, get tired, sit down to rest and never get back up. Clara, stay with me." Eli's voice cut through the fog. "Don't you dare quit on me now." She tried to answer, but her jaw wouldn't work right. Everything was so cold, so heavy. And then, through the white chaos of the storm, she saw it, a dark shape, low and square. The cabin. Eli saw it too. "Almost there. Just a little more." He half carried, half dragged her the last 50 yards, and when they reached the door, he had to kick it 3 times before the frozen latch gave way. They stumbled inside, and Eli slammed the door behind them, shutting out the wind. The silence was shocking, complete. Clara stood in the middle of the small room, swaying, unable to stop shaking. "Clothes," Eli said, his voice tight with urgency. "We need to get out of these clothes now." Clara tried to move, but her fingers wouldn't cooperate. Couldn't grip the buttons on her coat, couldn't do anything except shake. Eli was beside her immediately, his own hands clumsy with cold but functional. "I'm sorry, I have to." He didn't finish, just started working the buttons of her coat, peeling the frozen fabric away from her body. Clara should have been embarrassed, should have protested, but she was too cold to care about modesty, too cold to care about anything except the desperate need to get warm. Eli stripped her down to her undergarments, then grabbed a wool blanket from the corner, dusty and moth-eaten but dry, and wrapped it around her shoulders. Then he turned away, stripping off his own soaked clothes with shaking hands, wrapping himself in another blanket. The cabin was small, barely more than a single room with a fireplace and a rough wooden bed frame in the corner. But it had walls, had a roof, had wood stacked beside the fireplace. Eli moved to the hearth, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. He tried to strike a match, but his hands were shaking too hard. The match broke. He tried again. It broke again. "Damn it!" His voice cracked with frustration and fear. Clara knelt beside him, pulling the blanket tighter around herself. "Let me." Her hands were steadier, not by much, but enough. She took the matches from him, struck one carefully, and held it to the kindling Eli had arranged. The flame caught, small and fragile, and they both held their breath as it grew, spreading to the larger pieces of wood. When the fire finally began to burn in earnest, Clara felt tears of relief stream down her frozen cheeks. They huddled in front of it, blankets wrapped tight, and waited for the warmth to reach them. It took a long time, longer than Clara thought possible. But gradually, painfully, feeling began to return to her fingers and toes, first as numbness, then as sharp burning pain that made her gasp. "I know," Eli said quietly, his own face twisted with discomfort. "I know it hurts. That's good, means nothing's frozen." Clara nodded, unable to speak through the pain. She focused on breathing, on the fire, on the slow return of sensation to her body. Outside, the storm raged on. The wind screamed and the cabin shook, but the walls held. The fire held, and slowly, incrementally, they began to thaw. An hour passed, maybe more. Time felt strange in the small space, measured only by the crackling of the fire and the howling of the wind. When Clara could finally speak without her teeth chattering, she said, "Thank you for getting us here." Eli looked at her, his face half shadowed by firelight. "You came all this way in a storm. I should be thanking you. I didn't know there'd be a storm." "Still came, though." Clara pulled the blanket tighter. "I had to. Why?" The question hung between them, simple and enormous. Clara stared into the fire, watching the flames dance, and tried to find words big enough to hold everything she was feeling. "Because my mother was right," she said finally. "Because I was too proud and too hurt to see what was right in front of me. Because you did something nobody else would have done, and I punished you for it. Clara, let me finish." She turned to look at him, and in the firelight his eyes were dark and steady. "You bought my debt because you wanted to give me freedom, and I couldn't see it. Couldn't see past my own pride and fear to understand that you were giving me the one thing I needed most, a chance to breathe. You had every right to be angry, maybe, but I didn't have the right to send you away. Not without hearing you, not without understanding." She swallowed hard. "My mother spent her last weeks telling me I was a fool, and she was right." Eli shook his head slowly. "You're not a fool. You're human. You got hurt. That's what humans do. So do you." The words were soft, but they landed with weight. Eli flinched slightly, looking away. "I hurt you," Clara continued. "I know I did. And I'm sorry, Eli. I'm so sorry." For a long moment, Eli didn't speak, just stared into the fire, his jaw working like he was chewing on words too big to swallow. Finally, he said, "I spent my whole life running from things, from debts I couldn't pay, from people I couldn't help, from a past I couldn't change." He paused, his voice rough. "And then I heard about you and I thought, here's something I can fix. Here's one thing I can do right. You did do it right. No, I lied to you. I kept secrets. I let you think I was just some drifter when all along I was—" "Saving me," Clara interrupted. "You were saving me, Eli. And maybe you did it wrong. Maybe you should have told me from the start. But you still did it, when nobody else would. When nobody else even cared to try." Eli turned to look at her then, and she saw the pain in his eyes, the guilt, the desperate need to be understood. "I didn't want your gratitude," he said quietly. "I just wanted you to be free. I know, and that's why I came after you." Clara reached out, her hand finding his beneath the blanket. "Because a man who gives without expecting anything in return is rare, Eli. Rare and precious. And I almost lost you because I was too blind to see it." Their fingers intertwined, and Clara felt something shift in the air between them. Something that had been broken was beginning to mend. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough. "Your mother died," Eli said softly. It wasn't a question. Clara nodded, tears welling up fresh. 3 days before Christmas. Peacefully. She just slipped away. "I'm so sorry. She told me to find you. Her last words were to find you and tell you I understood. Tell you I forgave you." Clara squeezed his hand. "So I'm telling you now. I understand. I forgive you. And I'm asking—" Her voice broke. "I'm asking if you can forgive me." Eli pulled her close then, wrapping his arms around her, blanket and all, and Clara felt his breath hitch against her hair. "Nothing to forgive," he whispered. "Nothing at all." They held each other in front of the fire while the storm raged outside, and for the first time in months, Clara felt something other than grief and exhaustion. She felt whole. They talked through the night, feeding the fire, sharing the story of everything that had happened since that terrible autumn day. Eli told her about the logging camp, about the work that never stopped, the men who asked no questions, the way he'd tried to outrun his guilt and failed, about the nights he'd spent staring at the ceiling, wondering if she'd read his letter, wondering if she hated him. Clara told him about the winter on the farm, about her mother's decline, the loneliness that had pressed in from all sides, the way the debt papers had arrived, and she'd felt nothing but emptiness. About the funeral, the ride north, the desperate need to find him before it was too late. "I kept thinking," Clara said quietly, "what if I'm too late? What if he's moved on, or what if he doesn't want to see me?" "I would have wanted to see you," Eli said, his voice rough with emotion. "Every single day I wanted to see you." "Then why didn't you come back?" Eli was quiet for a moment, staring into the fire. "Because I thought that's what you wanted. Thought you needed space from me, from the lie, from everything. What I needed was the truth. even if it hurt, even if it was messy. Clara turned to face him fully. I don't want space, Eli. I want... She stopped, the words catching in her throat. Because what she wanted was big and terrifying and impossible to take back once she said it. But Eli's eyes were on her, patient and steady, and she knew he would wait, would give her all the time she needed. I want you, she finished quietly. Not just your help, not just your kindness. You, all of you, even the parts that make mistakes. Eli's breath caught. Clara, I know it's complicated. I know we've got a lot to figure out, but I'm done being afraid of wanting things. Done letting pride make decisions for me. She met his eyes, her voice steady now. So I'm telling you, I want you in my life, and if you want that too, then we'll figure out the rest. For a long moment, Eli just looked at her. Then slowly he reached up and cupped her face in his hands. Rough, calloused hands that had fixed fences and roofs and so many broken things. I've wanted that since the first day I saw you, he said softly. Wanted it so much it scared me. You don't have to be scared anymore. Neither do you. And then he kissed her, soft and careful, like she was something precious that might break. Clara leaned into it, her hands coming up to grip his shoulders, and felt everything else fall away. The storm, the past, the hurt. All of it dissolved in the warmth of his mouth on hers, in the solid reality of his presence. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Eli rested his forehead against hers. We're going to do this right, he said. No more secrets, no more lies, just truth. Even when it's hard, especially when it's hard, Clara agreed. They sealed it with another kiss, and outside, the storm began to break. Morning came cold and brilliant. Clara woke to find herself curled against Eli's chest, both of them still wrapped in blankets. The fire burned down to embers. For a moment she didn't move, just lay there, listening to his heartbeat, feeling the rise and fall of his breathing. This was real. He was real. And somehow, against all odds, they'd found their way back to each other. Eli stirred, his arms tightening around her. Morning, he murmured, his voice rough with sleep. Morning. They lay there for a few minutes more, neither wanting to break the spell. But eventually, the cold won out, and they had to move, stoking the fire, checking their clothes, assessing the damage. Their clothes were still damp but wearable. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world transformed. Everything buried under 2 feet of fresh snow, the trees bowed under the weight of ice, the sky so blue it hurt to look at. We should get back to camp, Eli said, pulling on his stiff pants and wincing. They'll be worried. Clara nodded, dressing quickly, her body protesting every movement. But underneath the exhaustion, she felt something else, something that felt like hope. They stepped outside into the blindingly white world and began the trek back to camp, walking side by side, their breath steaming in the frozen air. It took them over an hour, breaking trail through the deep snow, but when they finally emerged from the trees and saw the camp ahead, Clara felt a surge of relief. Hank was standing outside the main building, arms crossed, and when he saw them, his expression shifted from concern to something that might have been amusement. Well, he called out, you two look like hell. Eli managed a tired smile. Feel like it too. Hank's eyes moved between them, taking in their wet clothes, their exhaustion, the way they stood close enough that their shoulders touched. Figured you'd either be dead or reconciled. Glad it's the latter. Clara felt her cheeks heat despite the cold. Thank you for telling me where to find him. Hank shrugged. Man's been working himself to death for weeks. Figured he needed a reason to stop. He has one now, Clara said, glancing at Eli. Eli's hand found hers, their fingers intertwining naturally, and he squeezed gently. Yeah, I do. They stayed at the camp for 2 more days while Clara rested and their clothes dried properly. The men were respectful if curious, and Hank made sure Clara had a space in one of the storage buildings that was cleaner and warmer than the bunkhouse. Eli worked during the days but came back every evening, and they sat together by whatever fire was available, making plans. The farm, Clara said on the second night. It needs work before spring. I know. I'll help. You don't have to. Clara. Eli took her hand, his expression serious. I'm not helping. I'm coming home. With you, if you'll have me. Clara felt tears prick her eyes. You mean, I'm done drifting, done running. You asked me what I want, and I'm telling you, I want to build something. With you. On that farm. Something that lasts. It won't be easy. The land is hard. The work is harder. I know, but we'll do it together. Clara leaned forward and kissed him, tasting salt and smoke and promise. Together, she agreed. On the third day, they said goodbye to the camp. Hank paid Eli his wages, which he immediately tried to give to Clara. She pushed it back. Our wages, for our farm, for our future. Eli smiled, that small, rare smile that transformed his whole face, and pocketed the money. Our future. I like the sound of that. They rode out together as the sun climbed over the mountains, turning the snow to gold. Clara on her mare, Eli on his gray horse, side by side like partners, like equals, like people who'd been through winter and come out the other side still standing. The ride back south took 5 days. They traveled slowly, stopping in towns to rest and resupply, sleeping in barns or under the stars when the weather allowed. And every night, they talked about the farm, about the future, about the life they wanted to build. No more secrets, no more silence, just truth, laid out between them like foundation stones. By the time they reached the valley, spring was beginning to creep in. The snow was melting, revealing brown earth and the first brave shoots of green. The farm looked exactly as Clara had left it, weathered and worn but standing. They dismounted in the yard, and Clara looked around at the place that had nearly broken her, the place that had been saved by a man who'd believed she deserved better. "It's not much," she said quietly. Eli came to stand beside her, his arms sliding around her waist. "It's everything." And as they stood there together, watching the sun set over the valley they would rebuild, Clara felt her mother's presence like a benediction. "You found him. You told him. Well done, child." She closed her eyes and whispered a silent thank you to the woman who'd given her life twice, once at birth and once with her dying breath. Then she took Eli's hand and walked toward the house, toward home, toward the future they would build together, one fence post, one planted seed, one kept promise at a time. The storm had passed. The winter was ending. And redemption, it turned out, looked like two people choosing each other every single day. Not because it was easy, but because it was worth it. When spring returned to the valley, so did they, not as strangers, but as something new. Something forged in winter and made stronger by the cold. Something that looked, finally, like home. The valley woke slowly that spring, like something that had been sleeping too long and wasn't sure it wanted to rise. Clara stood at the edge of the garden plot, a hoe in her hands, and watched the sun climb over the eastern hills. The air was cool but no longer cold, carrying the scent of wet earth and new growth. Behind her she could hear Eli working on the barn door, the steady rhythm of hammer on wood that had become the soundtrack of their days. 3 months had passed since they'd returned to the farm. 3 months of work that never seemed to end but somehow never felt like burden. They'd cleared the fields, mended every fence, replanted the garden. They'd worked side by side from dawn until dusk, and at night they'd fallen into bed exhausted and content. The farm was coming back to life, and so were they. Clara dug the hoe into the earth, feeling it give way beneath the blade, and smiled. The soil was good here, rich and dark. It just needed someone to tend it, someone to believe it was worth the effort. "You planning to plant those seeds or just stare at the dirt all morning?" She turned to find Eli walking toward her, his shirt sleeves rolled up, sawdust in his hair. He was grinning, that rare, full grin that still surprised her every time she saw it. "I'm appreciating the moment," she said. "You should try it sometime. I appreciate every moment I'm with you." He came up beside her and kissed her temple, casual and easy, like they'd been doing this for years instead of months. "But those seeds aren't going to plant themselves." Clara laughed and handed him a packet of bean seeds. "Fine. You take that row, I'll take this one." They worked together in comfortable silence, kneeling in the dirt, pressing seeds into the earth at measured intervals. The sun warmed their backs, and birds sang in the trees at the edge of the property, and for a while the world felt perfectly, impossibly right. "I've been thinking," Eli said after a while, sitting back on his heels. "Dangerous habit." He smiled. "I've been thinking about the barn, how much space there is, how we're only using half of it." Clara paused, looking up at him. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting we use it. Open it up, make it available." "Available for what?" Eli was quiet for a moment, his eyes distant. Then he looked at her, and she saw something in his expression that made her chest tighten. "For people like you were, like your mother was. People who are drowning and don't have anywhere to turn. Clara set down her seeds and gave him her full attention. You want to help people? I want to give back what was given to us. To you. He gestured at the farm, at everything around them. We have food now. Have space. Hell, Clara, we have more than we need. Seems wrong to keep it to ourselves when there are people out there who are where you were a year ago. Clara felt tears prick her eyes. You want to open our home to strangers? Not strangers, neighbors. People from town who are struggling. People who just need a meal or a place to rest or someone to tell them they're not alone. She stared at him, this man who had saved her with nothing but kindness and money he could barely afford, and felt her heart expand until it hurt. You're serious, dead serious. It won't make us popular. People already talk about us. About you. Let them talk. Eli reached out and took her hand, dirt-stained and calloused. I'm done caring what people think. I care about what's right. And this feels right. Clara looked at the barn, at the space that had once held nothing but broken equipment and mice, looked at the farm that had been dying a year ago and was now green with life, looked at the man beside her who had taught her that kindness wasn't weakness. Okay, she said quietly. Okay? Okay. She squeezed his hand. Let's do it. Let's give back. Eli's face broke into a smile so wide, so full of joy, that Clara couldn't help but laugh. He pulled her close and kissed her, deep and grateful, and she melted into it, tasting dirt and sweat and promise. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Eli rested his forehead against hers. I love you, Clara Wren. It was the first time he'd said it out loud, and the words hung in the air between them like something sacred. Clara felt tears stream down her cheeks. I love you too, Eli Mercer. They held each other in the garden, surrounded by seeds waiting to grow, and felt the future unfold before them like a map. The first Sunday in May, they opened the barn doors. They'd spent the previous week cleaning it out, building long tables from salvaged wood, arranging benches and chairs they'd collected from around the farm. Eli had repaired the roof, patched every hole, and hung lanterns from the rafters. Clara had swept the floor until it gleamed and hung wildflowers from the posts. It looked nothing like a barn anymore. It looked like hope. They'd put up a simple sign at the edge of the property, Sunday supper. All welcome, no cost. Clara wasn't sure anyone would come. The town had been gossiping about them for months, about the drifter who'd bought a widow's debt, about the woman who'd taken him in, about their unmarried state, and the scandal of it all. But at 4 o'clock, as the sun began its slow descent toward the hills, she saw the first wagon turn onto the property. Someone's here, she called to Eli, who was inside lighting the lanterns. He came out to stand beside her, wiping his hands on a rag, and they watched together as the wagon drew closer. It was old Mrs. Patterson, the banker's mother, sitting beside a younger woman Clara didn't recognize. They pulled up near the barn, and Mrs. Patterson climbed down slowly, her movements stiff with age. Miss Wren, she said, nodding. Her eyes moved to Eli. Mr. Mercer, Mrs. Patterson. Clara stepped forward, suddenly nervous. Thank you for coming. The old woman studied them both with sharp eyes that missed nothing. Then, slowly, she smiled. My grandson tells me you're feeding people. Figured I'd come see if that included stubborn old women. Clara felt relief flood through her. It includes everyone. Good. Because I brought my niece. Sarah. Lost her husband last winter. Has 3 children and no way to feed them all. Mrs. Patterson gestured to the younger woman, who was still sitting in the wagon, looking uncertain. Figured she could use a decent meal. She's more than welcome. Eli walked over to the wagon and offered his hand to Sarah. Ma'am. Sarah took it hesitantly and climbed down. And Clara saw the way her dress hung loose on her frame, the shadows under her eyes. Saw the way she held herself, like someone who'd been carrying too much weight for too long. Thank you, Sarah whispered, for doing this. No thanks needed, Clara said gently. Come on, let's get you inside. They'd barely gotten Mrs. Patterson and Sarah settled at one of the tables when another wagon arrived. Then another, and another. By 5 o'clock the barn was full. Families with children who ran between the tables, their laughter echoing off the rafters. Old men who came alone, sitting quietly with their hats in their laps. Women who looked like Sarah, exhausted, worn down by circumstances beyond their control. And they all ate the stew Clara had made from their own vegetables and the bread Eli had learned to bake. ate until their bellies were full and their faces relaxed and the barn filled with the sound of conversation and gratitude. Clara moved through the crowd, refilling bowls, smiling, listening to stories of hardship and survival, and everywhere she looked, she saw Eli, kneeling beside children to hear their stories, helping an old man cut his bread, laughing with farmers who'd lost their crops to the same storms that had nearly broken Clara. He moved through the space like he belonged there, like this giving, this serving, was what he'd been meant to do all along. When the food was gone and the sun had set, people began to leave, but they left slowly, reluctantly, thanking Clara and Eli over and over until the words became a litany. God bless you. You don't know what this means. We'll be back if you'll have us. Clara stood at the barn door and watched them go, wagon after wagon disappearing into the darkness, and felt something profound settle in her chest. This was what mercy looked like, not just receiving it, but passing it on. The Sunday suppers became a ritual. Every week, they opened the barn, and every week more people came. Word spread through the valley about the couple who'd been outcasts and had chosen to give rather than hoard, about the food that was freely offered, about the space where no one was judged or turned away. Some weeks they fed 30 people, other weeks, 50. Clara and Eli worked themselves to exhaustion, but it was a different kind of tired than before. This was the exhaustion that came from purpose, from meaning. And slowly, something else began to happen. People started helping. Mrs. Patterson began bringing bread. Sarah, the widow, started arriving early to help set tables. Farmers donated vegetables when they had extra. The blacksmith repaired their tools for free. Even Mr. Brennan from the general store, who'd been one of the first to gossip about them, began sending supplies. The community that had once turned its back was learning to turn toward each other instead. One Sunday in late June, Clara stood at the barn door and watched the scene inside. Children playing, adults talking and laughing, plates being passed and shared, and felt Eli's arm slide around her waist. We did this, he said quietly. No. Clara leaned into him. You did this. You started it when you bought that debt, when you believed kindness was worth the cost. We're doing it together now. Yeah. She smiled, turning to look at him. We are. He kissed her then, soft and sweet, and Clara heard a few whistles from inside the barn. They pulled apart, laughing, and Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks. Think it's time we made that official? Eli asked, his eyes dancing with amusement. Clara's breath caught. Are you asking? I'm asking if you'll marry me, Clara Wren. He took her hands, his expression turning serious. I'm asking if you'll let me spend the rest of my life giving back everything good you've taught me. If you'll let me be your partner in this, in all of it. Clara felt tears stream down her face, but she was smiling so wide it hurt. Yes, Eli Mercer, I'll marry you. The barn erupted in cheers, and Clara realized their entire congregation had been listening. She didn't care. Let them hear, let them see, let the whole valley know that mercy had brought them together and love was keeping them that way. Eli swept her up in his arms and spun her around, both of them laughing, and when he set her down, they were surrounded by people offering congratulations and blessings. It was perfect, messy and loud and absolutely perfect. They were married in late summer, in the same barn where they fed the valley. The preacher came, reluctantly at first, but he came. Nearly everyone they'd served over the past months came too, filling the barn to overflowing. Even some of the town's more respectable citizens showed up, their curiosity finally outweighing their judgment. Clara wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit, and carried wildflowers from the garden. Eli wore his cleanest shirt and pants, his hair combed back, his eyes never leaving Clara's face as she walked toward him. They spoke their vows in front of everyone, promises to love and honor, to work side by side, to give freely and live honestly, and when the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, the barn shook with applause. The celebration lasted into the night, music and dancing and more food than they'd ever served. And through it all, Clara kept finding Eli's eyes across the crowd, kept seeing the joy and wonder there, kept thinking about how far they'd both come, from strangers to partners, from broken to whole, from surviving to thriving. That night, after everyone had gone and the barn was quiet, Clara and Eli walked hand in hand through the garden, looking up at the stars. Your mother would be proud, Eli said softly. Clara nodded, her throat tight. She knew. Before she died, she knew this was how it would turn out. She told me to find you, to forgive. She knew what I couldn't see yet, that we belonged together. That mercy deserved mercy. That kindness wasn't weakness. Clara stopped walking and turned to face him. That love was worth fighting for. Eli pulled her close, and they swayed together in the starlight. No music except the wind through the grass and the distant call of night birds. I'd fight for you every day, he murmured against her hair. Every single day for the rest of my life. You won't have to fight, Clara whispered back. I'm not going anywhere. Neither am I. And it was true. The drifter had finally stopped drifting, had finally found a place worth staying for, a person worth staying with. They'd built something here, something bigger than themselves. Something that would outlast them. Years passed. The Sunday suppers continued, growing and changing with the seasons. The barn became a gathering place not just for meals but for community, for births and deaths, for celebrations and mourning, for everything that made up the fabric of human life. Clara and Eli worked the farm, raised children of their own, and taught them the same lessons they'd learned the hard way. That kindness was a choice, that mercy was powerful, that giving was its own reward. They hung her mother's old ledger on the barn wall, its pages blank, a reminder of debts forgiven and grace freely given. Beneath it, they added a simple inscription: what was bought with kindness is kept with love. And every Sunday, when people gathered and ate and laughed together, Clara would look around at the faces, some familiar, some new, all welcome. And remember the storm and the debt, remember the stranger who'd paid it, remember the winter that had nearly broken them and the spring that had brought them back to life. Remember that mercy, once given, had a way of multiplying, of spreading like seeds in good soil, of growing into something beautiful and lasting. On warm evenings, she and Eli would sit on the porch, the same porch where they'd first shared coffee, where they'd begun to trust each other, where they'd learned that broken things could be mended, and they'd watch the sun set over the valley, their hands intertwined, their lives woven together so completely that neither could remember what it felt like to be alone. No regrets? Clara would ask sometimes, even though she knew the answer. Not a single one, Eli would reply, pulling her close. This life we built, it's everything I never knew I needed. We built it together. Yeah, we did. And in those moments, as the light faded and the stars began to appear, Clara would close her eyes and feel her mother's presence like a benediction, would feel the weight of every choice that had led them here, the good ones and the bad ones, the painful ones and the joyful ones, would feel grateful for all of it. Because this was what redemption looked like. Not a single moment of forgiveness, but a lifetime of choosing grace, of giving back what had been given, of building something that would outlast them both. The wind moved through the valley, carrying the scent of growing things and the distant sound of children laughing. Carried it across the fields they'd planted, through the barn they'd opened, over the graves of those who'd come before. Carried it like a song, like a promise, like a prayer of thanksgiving for mercy that had outlived the storm. And far off, where the sky met the earth in shades of gold and purple, the last light of day touched everything. The house, the barn, the garden, the two people sitting together in perfect peace, blessing it all with the glow of grace. In the end, it wasn't the grand gesture that mattered, not the debt paid or the farm saved or even the barn full of people every Sunday. It was the small things, the daily choosing, the way Eli still fixed Clara's coffee exactly how she liked it, the way she still smiled when she heard his hammer in the morning, the way they worked side by side year after year, building something that couldn't be measured in dollars or acres, building a life of meaning, of purpose, of love that asked for nothing and gave everything. And when they were old and gray, sitting on that same porch with grandchildren playing in the yard, they would tell the story, the one about the storm and the stranger and the debt bought in secret, would tell it so the children would understand that mercy wasn't just something you received, it was something you became, would tell it so the next generation would know what you do with your kindness matters, what you build with your love lasts, what you give away comes back multiplied. The sun would set, the stars would come out, and the story would continue, passed down through children and grandchildren, through the people who ate at their table, and the community that had learned to love instead of judge. The story of how two broken people found each other in the wreckage of debt and storm, and built something beautiful from the ruins. The story of mercy that didn't count the cost, The story of love that gave back again and again and again, until giving became breathing and breathing became life. And the valley would remember, would hold their story in its soil and its stones and its wind, would whisper it to those who came after. This is what grace looks like. This is what it means to forgive. This is how broken things become whole. The wind moved through golden fields, whispering of mercy that outlived the storm. And somewhere, in the space between earth and heaven, a mother smiled, knowing her daughter had finally learned the lesson she'd spent a lifetime trying to teach. That love, in the end, was the only debt worth paying, and the only one that, once given, could never be taken away.